The heavy metallic doors of the Varaxian detention facility slid open with a harsh, grinding sound that echoed through the corridors. Commander Theshvar stepped into the interrogation chamber, his massive frame casting long shadows across the polished floor. The room was designed to intimidate cold blue lighting, reinforced titanium walls, surveillance equipment that monitored every heartbeat and breath. Across the mirror-like table sat Gorthal. The sight of him made even the seasoned commander pause. The once proud shock trooper of the 47th Assault Division looked like he had been through a meat grinder. His purple carapace, which should have gleamed with the polish of military pride, was cracked and scarred. Deep gouges ran along his arms where human weapons had found their mark. One of his 4 eyes was clouded over, a reminder of some desperate human's last stand. But it wasn't the physical damage that concerned Commander Thekvar. It was the way Gorthal sat hunched forward, his claws constantly tapping against the table in a nervous rhythm. His remaining 3 eyes darted around the room like a hunted animal, never focusing on one spot for too long. This was a soldier who had seen something that had broken him on fundamental level. The tribunal members filed in behind the commander, their robes rustling with authority. Admiral Kextel, the military strategist whose campaigns had conquered 17 star systems. General Vorthon, whose ground forces had never failed to crush resistance. And Professor Elithmer, the xenobiologist who had studied dozens of alien species to find their weaknesses. Together, they represented the pinnacle of Raxian military might. Soldier Gorthal, Commander Thekvar began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The sound bounced off the walls, amplified by the chamber's acoustics to create an almost divine resonance. You were part of the 47th Assault Division that engaged the human colony on Kepler 440b. Your unit suffered 73% casualties against what our intelligence deemed primitive mammals. Explain this failure. Gorthal's mandibles clicked anxiously, a sound like breaking glass. His good eyes finally met the commander's gaze. What Thekvar saw there made his own blood run cold. Fear, pure, undiluted terror from a soldier who had faced plasma cannons and energy weapons without flinching. Commander, with respect, your intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Gorthal's voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from whatever horrors he had witnessed. These humans, they are not like any species we have encountered in our 1,000-year expansion across the galaxy. Admiral Kextal leaned forward, his tentacles writhing with impatience. Elaborate soldier, we've conquered species with advanced technology. Beings with natural armor thicker than battle cruiser hulls, creatures that could survive in the vacuum of space. What makes these soft-skinned mammals different? Gorthal's claws stopped their nervous tapping. For a moment, the only sound in the chamber was the low hum of the facility's power systems. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, the tone of someone who had looked into the abyss and seen it looking back. They do not fight like civilized beings. They fight like ... He paused, searching for words that could convey the impossible. Truth he had witnessed, like creatures possessed by death itself. But that's not even the worst part, Commander. The worst part is their names. I remember their names. They made sure we knew them. General Vorthan's armor plates shifted with skepticism. Names. Significance do individual identifiers have in warfare? Everything, Gorthal replied, his voice gaining strength as terrible memories flooded back. In our military doctrine, soldiers are numbers, units, expendable resources in the great machine of conquest. But these humans, they fought as individuals. Each one had a name, a story, a reason for being there that went beyond mere survival. Professor Elithmer activated his recording device, scientific curiosity overriding his discomfort. This is fascinating from a behavioral standpoint. Please continue. When we landed on their world, we expected fear. We expected surrender. We expected the logical response of a weaker species facing inevitable defeat. Gorthal's scarred carapace began to tremble. Instead, we found beings who seemed to welcome the fight. Not because they were confident of victory, but because they had something worth dying for. The chamber fell silent except for the steady rhythm of alien breathing. Commander HFY felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. In all his years of military service, he had never heard a soldier speak with such reverence about an enemy. They didn't just fight us, Gorthal continued, his voice now carrying an almost hypnotic quality. They studied us, learned from us, adapted to us. With every engagement, they became more dangerous, not because they had better weapons or superior numbers, but because they refused to accept defeat as a possibility. The tribunal members exchanged glances, their confidence in Varaxian's superiority beginning to crack. They had come here expecting to analyze a tactical failure, to identify weaknesses in their strategy that could be corrected. Instead, they were hearing something that challenged the very foundation of their military philosophy. "Tell us everything," Commander HFY commanded, settling back in his chair. "From the beginning, leave nothing out." Gorthal's remaining eyes took on a distant look, as if he were seeing through the walls of the chamber to some far-off battlefield where the impossible had become reality. The tribunal leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves by the promise of a story that would change everything they thought they knew about warfare, about courage, and about the species they had so foolishly decided to challenge. The interrogation was about to begin, and none of them were prepared for the truth that would emerge from the shadows of Kepler-44b. The morning sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the peaceful mining colony as Gorthal began his haunting recollection. His claws scraped against the metal table, leaving thin scratches that reflected the chamber's harsh lighting. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like the ticking of a broken clock counting down to disaster. "We landed at dawn on the mining colony," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 regrets. 3,000 of our finest warriors equipped with the latest plasma weaponry and battle armor, against what our intelligence estimated to be 500 human colonists. Simple farmers, miners, and their families. It should have been over within hours. Commander HFY leaned back in his chair, studying the broken soldier before him. What went wrong? Us. Remaining good-eye focused on something beyond the chamber walls, as if he could see through time itself to that fateful morning. Everything. From the very first moment we set foot on their world, nothing went according to plan. The aliens' breathing became shallow as the memories flooded back. Our dropships landed in perfect formation across their agricultural sector. Standard protocol: establish a perimeter, eliminate any immediate threats, then move toward the population center. Clean, efficient, textbook execution. But, prompted General Vorthan, but the humans had been watching us since we entered their star system. They knew we were coming and they had prepared. Gorthal's mandibles clicked nervously. First human we encountered was a female named Hannah. She was tending to what appeared to be food cultivation when our advanced scouts found her. Professor Elithmer activated his recording device. His scientific curiosity piqued. Describe this encounter in detail. She was kneeling among rows of green plants, her hands covered in soil, completely absorbed in her work. When our scouts approached, she looked up with these strange human eyes, not the cold calculation of a warrior, but something else. Something that made my soldiers hesitate. The chamber fell silent as Gorthal continued. Squad leader Vextal approached her with his plasma rifle raised, standard intimidation tactics. We expected surrender, perhaps pleas for mercy. Instead, she stood up slowly, brushed the dirt from her hands, and looked directly at our weapons.
A what?
Did she do? Admiral Kextel asked, his tentacles writhing with anticipation. She smiled. Not the smile of fear or submission, but something that made our translators struggle to interpret. Then she said something in their language that chilled us to the bone. Gorthal's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You picked the wrong farm. The tribunal members exchanged glances, unsure of the significance. Before we could react, she pressed something in her hand, a simple device, no bigger than a communication unit. Gorthal's scarred carapace began to tremble. The entire field exploded. It's not just the area around her, but the entire agricultural sector. She had turned their farming equipment into improvised explosive devices. Irrigation systems became fragmentation bombs. Fertilizer storage became incendiary charges. Harvesting machines became shrapnel launchers. Eyes widened. One human did all this? Hannah died in that blast, but she took 12 of my comrades with her. 12 trained Varaxian shock troopers, eliminated by a farmer who had probably never held a weapon in her life. Gorthal's voice cracked with emotion. But that was just the beginning. As the smoke cleared and we regrouped, we realized this wasn't random destruction. It was strategic. She had eliminated our landing zone, forced us to advance through terrain of her choosing. The alien soldier's breathing became labored as he continued. As we advanced toward their main settlement, moving through the burning remains of what had been peaceful farmland, we encountered resistance unlike anything in our military manuals. Not organized like a proper army, but chaotic, unpredictable, and terrifyingly effective. Describe the next engagement, General Vorthen commanded. We encountered a human male named Doan. He was barely out of their juvenile stage. What they call a teenager. By our standards, he should have been in learning facilities, not on a battlefield. Gorthel's mandibles clicked rapidly, but this young human led our entire second platoon into a canyon where they had positioned crude projectile weapons. Professor Elithamer looked up from his recording device. It's projectile weapons against plasma rifles? How is that possible? Good. It wasn't about the weapons. It was about the mind behind them. Gorthel's voice grew stronger, filled with grudging respect. This child soldier managed to outmaneuver trained Vraxian warriors who had conquered 17 star systems. How? The incredulity in Commander Thekvar's voice was evident. Not outmaneuver, Gorthel corrected, his scarred features twisting into something that might have been a smile. Outsmart. Doan used their local wildlife creatures they called mountain cats as living proximity sensors. Every time we moved through the canyon, the animals would react to our presence, giving away our position to the humans positioned above us. The tribunal leaned forward, fascinated despite themselves. Meanwhile, this human youth was relaying our movements to his, people using simple reflected light signals. No advanced technology, no quantum communications, just mirrors and sunlight. But the coordination was perfect. Every step we took was anticipated, every move countered before we could execute it. Admiral Kextel's tentacles writhed with frustration. Surely, superior firepower eventually prevailed. You would think so. But these humans had turned the entire canyon into a trap. They had prepositioned rockfall triggers, created crossfire zones with their primitive weapons, and established escape routes that led us deeper into their killing ground. Gorthal's voice took on an almost reverent tone. When we finally cornered Dohan, he was bleeding from multiple plasma burns. Any civilized being would have surrendered. Any sane creature would have begged for mercy. The chamber fell silent, waiting for the conclusion they all dreaded to hear. Instead, he smiled. The same smile we had seen on Hannah's face. It's not the expression of defeat, but of victory, achieved through sacrifice. Gorthel's voice cracked with emotion. He triggered a rock slide that buried half our remaining force. The stones crushed him. As his young life was snuffed out, he was still signaling to his people. Still fighting. Still coordinating the resistance, even as he died. The alien soldier's claws stopped their nervous scratching. That's when we realized the truth. We weren't fighting soldiers. We weren't fighting warriors. We were fighting something. Far more dangerous humans who had something worth dying for. Commander Thekvar sat back in his chair, his confidence in Vraxian superiority beginning to crack. Continue your report, soldier. We need to understand what we're truly facing. Gorthal nodded slowly, his remaining eye focusing on memories that would haunt him forever. The worst, he knew, was yet to come. The interrogation chamber's temperature seemed to drop as Gorthel's voice took on a haunted quality. His scarred carapace glistened under the harsh lights, and the rhythmic clicking of his mandibles had become almost hypnotic. The tribunal members found themselves leaning forward, drawn into the nightmare that was about to unfold. The real horror began when we reached their main defensive position. Gorthal continued, his remaining good eye staring at the polished floor as if he could see through it to some distant battlefield. After losing nearly half our forces to farmers and children, we thought surely their military stronghold would be different, more conventional, more civilized. Commander Dekvar's armor plate shifted with anticipation. What did you find? They called it Firebase Delta. It wasn't much to look at. Converted mining structures reinforced with metal plating and whatever materials they could scavenge. 200 humans, including their wounded, against our remaining 2,000. Troops. Gorthel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper.
Ah!
The numbers should have been laughable. We had superior firepower, advanced armor, orbital support. Victory should have been guaranteed. Admiral Kuxthal's tentacles writhed impatiently. Surely overwhelming numbers prevailed. A sound escaped from Gorthal that might have been laughter. If laughter could carry the weight of absolute despair, you would think so. But these humans had a leader, a female named Sojin. She had lost one eye in the initial bombardment, plasma. Burns covering half her face, yet she coordinated their defense with terrifying precision. The alien soldiers' claws began their nervous scratching again, leaving fresh marks on the metal table. Commander Sojin moved through that fortress like a ghost. One moment she would be treating wounded soldiers, the next she would be directing artillery fire with surgical accuracy. Her remaining eyes seemed to see everything, every weakness in our assault, every opportunity to strike back. Professor Alithmer looked up from his recording device. Describe the siege tactics. There were no tactics. It's not in any sense we understood. Gorthel's voice gained strength as the memories flooded back. They held us off for 3 days. 3 impossible days where everything we thought we knew about warfare was turned upside down. General Vorthan's armor plates clicked with skepticism. How is that possible? Even with fortifications, 200 defenders against 2,000 attackers, because they didn't fight like defenders. They fought like they had already accepted death and were simply choosing how to die. Gorthel's mandibles clicked rapidly. On the first day, we launched a standard frontal assault. Plasma artillery, aerial bombardment, coordinated ground advance. By all military doctrine, it should have shattered their resistance within hours. The chamber fell silent except for the low hum of the facility's power systems. Instead, they turned their own bodies into weapons. A human male named Jae-Wan had both legs severed by plasma fire during our initial barrage. Any rational being would have sought medical attention or at least taken cover. Instead, he crawled, dragged himself across 200 meters of open ground while we were firing at him to reach our forward positions. Commander Thekvar felt a chill run down his spine. What happened? He detonated explosives with his dying breath. But not randomly. He had studied our formation, identified our command structure, and timed his sacrifice to maximum effect. 7 of our officers died in that blast, including our tactical coordinator. Gorthel's voice cracked. As he lay there, legs gone, bleeding out, he was still calculating how to hurt us most effectively. The tribunal members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but that was just the beginning. Another human called Mingy used her own blood to write messages on the walls, messages that somehow weakened our troops' morale just by reading them. Gorthel's scarred features twisted with remembered anguish. Our translators worked overtime, but the words seemed to carry power beyond their literal meaning. Professor Alithmer activated additional recording equipment. What did these messages say? We are not afraid of death. We're afraid of living without honor. And every one of you we kill is one less threat to our families. But the most disturbing was simply, we remember all your names. We will find your homes. Gorthel's voice grew quieter, that last one. Our soldiers began looking over their shoulders, even in the middle of battle. They started to understand that this wasn't just a military engagement, it was personal. The alien soldier's breathing became labored as he continued. On the second day, something happened that broke every rule of warfare we had ever learned. Their medical personnel, beings who should have been non-combatants, began treating our wounded alongside their own. Admiral Kexthal's tentacles writhed with confusion. They were helping your soldiers. Not helping, converting. Gorthel's mandibles clicked with nervous energy. They would treat our wounded, save their lives, and then whisper to them about human determination. About how their species never stops fighting for what they believe in. About how every human in that fortress had a family they would die to protect. Commander Thekvar leaned back in his chair. Psychological warfare. Worse, truth. These humans weren't trying to deceive our soldiers. We're showing them what it meant to fight for something greater than military orders. Gorthal's voice took on an almost reverent tone. By the third day, some of our own troops were refusing to advance. They had seen too much human resilience, too much sacrifice, too much pure determination. The chamber's atmosphere grew heavy with tension as Gorthal prepared to reveal the climax of his tale. The breaking point came when Commander Sojin herself, bleeding from dozens of wounds, walked into our command post carrying a dead man's switch. The alien's voice dropped to a whisper. She moved through our defenses like they didn't exist. Our sensors, our guards, our automated systems, nothing stopped her. She simply appeared in our most secure location like a ghost materializing from thin air. General Vorthan's armor plates shifted with disbelief. She was surrendering. She was negotiating, with a nuclear device strapped to her chest. Gorthal's remaining eye focused on each tribunal member in turn. Commander Sojin told our field commander that every human in that facility would die before they would surrender, and they would take as many of us with them as possible. But she offered an alternative: withdrawal from the planet, and no pursuit of our forces. The tribunal sat in stunned silence for a long moment. You accepted terms from a numerically inferior force. Commander Dekvar's voice carried a mixture of incredulity and growing dread. Gorthal looked up from the floor, his scarred features twisted into an expression of absolute certainty. We accepted terms from demons wearing human faces, because we realized that fighting them wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about whether any of us would survive to see our homeworlds again. The alien soldiers' claws stopped their nervous scratching. That's when we understood the truth. We weren't fighting an army. We were fighting a species that had turned survival itself into an art form. The interrogation chamber's lighting seemed to dim as Gorthal's carapace darkened, shifting from its usual purple hue to something closer to black. The change was involuntary, a biological response to memories so terrifying that his body reacted without conscious thought. Commander Dekvar had seen this phenomenon only once before, in soldiers who had witnessed the complete annihilation of their units. After the negotiated withdrawal from Firebase Delta, Command ordered us to conduct reconnaissance missions, Gorthal continued, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had doomed his comrades. High Command couldn't accept that a handful of human colonists had forced the mighty Vraxian military to retreat. They wanted to understand human capabilities before committing to a full planetary invasion. Admiral Kexthal's tentacles writhed with impatience. Standard military procedure. What went wrong? Everything. The single word hung in the air like a death sentence. We sent out 12 scouting parties of 10 soldiers each. 120 of our most elite reconnaissance specialists, equipped with the finest stealth technology, advanced sensors, and survival gear. Only 3 of us returned. The tribunal. Members exchanged glances, their confidence wavering like a candle flame in a hurricane. The humans had formed what they called hunting packs. Gorthal's voice became barely audible, as if speaking the words too loudly might somehow summon those terrifying memories back to life. Small groups of their warriors who pursued us through the wilderness for days, weeks even. They turned the entire planet into a hunting ground, and we were the prey. Commander Vekfar's armor plates shifted with disbelief. Our soldiers are trained for extended operations in hostile environments. How did primitive humans outlast them? Sound escaped from Gorthal that might have been laughter, if laughter could carry the essence of pure madness. Because they never stopped, never rested, never gave up. The first pack was led by a human named Quan. He and 3 others tracked my unit for 6 days through dense forest that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The alien soldiers' claws began their familiar scraping against the table, but this time the sound was different, more frantic, more desperate. We tried every evasion technique in our military handbook. We doubled back through streams to break our scent trail, split up into smaller groups to confuse pursuit. We even climbed to the treetops and traveled through the canopy like primitive creatures. They found us every time. Professor Elithmer looked up from his recording device, scientific curiosity battling with growing dread. Their tracking technology must have been remarkably advanced. They had no technology. Gorthal's mandibles clicked rapidly, creating a staccato rhythm that echoed through the chamber. No sensors, no satellites, no quantum tracking devices. They tracked us by scent, by disturbed vegetation, by the way we moved through their terrain. Kiwan could tell how many of us there were by examining broken branches. He knew which of us was wounded by studying our footprints in the mud. The tribunal leaned closer as Gorthel's voice grew more strained, as if each word was being torn from his throat. But the worst part wasn't their tracking ability. It was their psychological tactics. They would leave signs that they had been near our camps while we slept. Equipment moved just slightly from where we had left it. Food containers opened and resealed. Personal items rearranged in patterns that seemed random but felt deeply threatening. General Vorthen's armor plates clicked with nervous energy. Why didn't they simply attack? Why prolong the hunt? Because they wanted us to understand fear first. Gorthel's voice took on an almost reverent tone. Real fear, not the quick terror of battle, but the slow, grinding horror of being hunted by something that understood you better than you understood yourself. The alien soldier's breathing became labored as he continued. On the fourth day, they began picking off our scouts one by one. Never the same method twice. Yuna, another human in their pack, was a master of what they called silent. Killing, she could eliminate a trained Vraxian warrior without making a sound, without leaving a trace of her presence. Commander Thekfar felt his own breathing become shallow. Describe these eliminations. Vorthek simply vanished during his watch. We found him the next morning, hanging from a tree branch 50 meters above the ground. No sign of struggle. No indication of how he had gotten there. It was as if he had simply floated upward and died. Gorthel's scarred features twisted with remembered horror. Kleckstar disappeared while relieving himself. We heard no sound, no cry for help. When we investigated, we found only his weapon and a small pile of his personal belongings arranged. In a perfect circle, the chamber fell silent except for the steady hum of the facility's power systems and the increasingly frantic clicking of Gorthel's mandibles. By the sixth day, we were hallucinating from exhaustion and terror. We hadn't slept properly in 4 days. Every shadow seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Every sound in the forest might have been death approaching on silent feet. Alien's voice cracked with emotion. That's when Kiwan finally revealed himself. Admiral Kexel's tentacles writhed with anticipation. He attacked. He walked into our camp alone, unarmed, and sat down by our fire as if he had been invited for a meal. Gorthel's remaining good eye focused on something beyond the chamber. Walls. We had our weapons trained on him, but somehow none of us could bring ourselves to fire. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, even from his enemies. The tribunal members found themselves holding their breath. Did he want? Commander Thekfar asked. To talk? He told us about human history, how their species had been hunting in packs for hundreds of thousands of years. How they had evolved not just to kill their prey, but to understand it, to predict its movements, to become one with it. Voice grew quiet with something that might have been awe. He explained that hunting wasn't just about survival for humans. It was about connection. About understanding the mind of your quarry so completely that you could anticipate its every move. Professor Elithmer's recording device whirred softly in the silence. Kiwan said they weren't trying to defeat us. They were trying to teach us what it meant to be hunted by humans. To understand that we had entered their world, threatened their families, and now we would face the consequences of awakening something that had been sleeping in their genetic code for millennia. The alien soldier's claws stopped their nervous scratching. Then he offered us a choice. Return to our ships and leave their world, or discover what happened to the other scouting parties. We chose to leave. And the others. General Vorthen's voice was barely above a whisper. As we departed, I saw what remained of the other reconnaissance teams. Gorthel's mandibles clicked once, a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The humans had arranged their bodies in geometric patterns visible from orbit. Perfect circles, triangles, and other shapes that seemed to pulse with meaning when viewed from above. Commander Thesharmor's armor plates shifted with growing dread. What was the message? That Earth's children had learned to hunt among the stars. Any who threatened their families would become part of their art. Gorthel's scarred carapace seemed to darken further. We weren't just defeated. We were transformed into a warning for others who might follow in our footsteps. The interrogation chamber fell silent as the tribunal contemplated the implications of what they had heard. In the distance, the facility's systems hummed with mechanical precision. But the sound now seemed ominous rather than comforting. The interrogation chamber fell silent as Gorthel gathered himself for his final account. The broken soldier's scarred carapace had shifted to its darkest shade, and his remaining good eye held depths of knowledge that no warrior should ever possess. Commander Thekfar waited patiently, though his own composure was beginning to crack. Like ice under pressure. The weight of everything they had heard was settling on the tribunal like a suffocating blanket. Commander, there is something else. Something that chills my core even now. Gorthel's mandibles clicked one final time, a sound like the closing of a tomb. As we prepared to leave the planet, I intercepted human communications. What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about their species. The chamber's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Admiral Kexthel's tentacles had stopped their restless writhing, frozen in anticipation of whatever revelation was about to shatter their understanding of galactic warfare. "Speak, Commander," the Jeffrar commanded, though his voice carried less authority than it had at the beginning of this session. Gorthel's claws scraped against the table one last time, leaving deep gouges in the metal surface. The colony we attacked, it was not a military installation. It was not even a major settlement. It was a small mining outpost, home to families and civilian workers. The humans we fought, Hannah, Doan, Sojin, Kiwan, Yuna, and the others, they were not professional soldiers. The tribunal exchanged shocked glances, their minds struggling to process this impossible information. General Vorthon's armor plates clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. "Impossible," Professor Elithmer breathed, his recording device forgotten in his trembling hands. I thought so too, but their communications confirmed it. Every terrible truth I had tried to deny. Gorthel's voice grew heavy with dread. Hannah was an agricultural specialist. She had spent her life making things grow, not making things die. Doan was a student, barely out of their educational system, studying to become an engineer. Sojin was a mining engineer who had never held a weapon before our ships appeared in their sky. The alien soldier's breathing became labored as he continued. Kiwan was a wilderness guide who helped tourists explore their planet's natural beauty. Yuna was a medical technician who had taken an oath to save lives, not take them. They were ordinary citizens who took up arms to defend their home. Commander Thekfar leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling from the implications. If these were not their warriors, then where were their actual military forces? "That is the question that haunts me," Gorthel interrupted, his voice rising, with barely contained terror. "During our retreat, as our damaged ships limped toward the edge of their star system, I detected massive energy signatures moving toward us. Ships, hundreds of them. The chamber's lighting seemed to flicker, as if the facility's power systems were responding to the growing tension in the room. When I enhanced our sensors, I saw the markings, military vessels from something they called the Earth Defense Force. But these weren't just any ships. They were dreadnoughts, carriers, and battle cruisers that dwarfed our largest vessels. Each one bristling with weapons that made our plasma cannons look like children's toys. Admiral Kextel's tentacles began, writhing again, but this time with fear rather than impatience. Their actual military was coming, not just military. According to their intercepted communications, news of our attack had spread across their entire species through something they called the Global Network. They were mobilizing not just their professional soldiers, but their entire population, billions of them, all demanding the right to fight for their colonial families. The tribunal sat in stunned silence as the full scope of humanity's response became clear. I monitored their communications for hours as we retreated, Gorthel continued, his voice taking on the quality of someone recounting a prophetic vision. Recruitment centers on every human world were overwhelmed with volunteers. Their military academies were fast-tracking graduates. Their industrial complexes were converting from civilian production to military manufacturing within days. Professor Elithmir's scientific mind struggled to comprehend the scale of mobilization. An entire species preparing for war. Not war. Vengeance. There is a difference. Gorthal's scarred features twisted into an expression of absolute certainty. They weren't mobilizing to conquer us. They were mobilizing to ensure that no species would ever again threaten human. Civilians. Every communication I intercepted carried the same message: protect the families, avenge the fallen, and make sure this never happens again. The alien soldier stood slowly, his damaged carapace catching the chamber's harsh light like a broken mirror reflecting nightmares. Commander, I respectfully request that you reconsider any plans for further human engagement. What we fought was not their army. It was not even their militia. It was a handful of civilians who refused to surrender their home. Commander Deshvar's voice was barely above a whisper. Your recommendation? We encountered perhaps their most terrifying truth. Humans do not fight for conquest or glory. They fight for each other. Every human we killed became a rallying cry for 1,000 more. Every act of courage we witnessed was not exceptional for their species. It was typical. Gorthal's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. We didn't defeat their soldiers. We awakened their entire civilization. The alien moved toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. Then he paused, turning back to face the tribunal one final time. There is a human saying, I learned from our communications intercepts, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber like a death knell. We are not trapped in here with you. We're trapped here with us. I believe this applies to any sector of space where humans choose to make their stand. Commander Thekvar called out as Gorthal reached the door, his authority cracking like a dam under pressure. What is your final assessment, soldier? Gorthal turned back, his remaining good. I'm meeting the commander's gaze with unflinching certainty. If we proceed with the invasion of their homeworld, we will not be conquerors. We will be the prey. And humans, Commander, are the most efficient predators the galaxy has ever produced. Oh. The alien soldier's mandibles clicked once more, a sound like the closing of a coffin lid. They don't just defeat their enemies. They study them, understand them, and then they become better at being human than their enemies are at being themselves. We thought we were hunting sheep. Instead, we awakened sleeping wolves. The door sealed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the tribunal in stunned silence to contemplate the implications of humanity's true nature. In the distance, the facility's systems continued their mechanical humming. But the sound now seemed less like efficiency and more like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning. Commander Thekvar stared at the door through which Gorthal had departed, his mind struggling to process everything he had heard. The Varaxian Empire had conquered 17 star systems, subjugated dozens of species, and spread its influence across a quarter of the galaxy. But now, for the first time in their 1,000-year expansion, they had encountered something that made them question not just their tactics, but their very survival. The humans were coming, and they were bringing with them a fury that had been forged in the fires of civilian courage and tempered by the bonds of species-wide solidarity. The tribunal sat in their chamber, surrounded by the technological marvels of their civilization, and realized that all their advanced weapons and superior numbers might not be enough to stop a species that had turned love into a weapon of war. In the growing darkness of the chamber, one thought echoed through each alien mind. They had not just attacked a human colony. They had declared war on the concept of family itself, and families, as they had learned too late, were worth dying for. The end.